Hi, and welcome to Classroom Confidential and Confidentially Speaking, a new series where I have informal chats with educators, artists, and just overall fascinating people. Today, my guest is Jordan Wiley-Hill, Program Coordinator for the Kids in Theater Outreach Program at the historic Fox Theater right here in Tucson, Arizona. Jordan is also a professional storyteller. Heck, I didn't even know such a thing existed, but he's traveled the world honing his craft, and his experiences are absolutely fascinating. We also talk about the importance of storytelling to the human race and the applications of storytelling in the classroom in order to achieve maximum student engagement. I hope you enjoy my discussion with Jordan Wiley-Hill. I know I did. Jordan, thank you so much for joining me today. It's a pleasure to talk to you. So you are a professional storyteller. I've never heard of such a thing, but it sounds completely awesome. Can you tell me a little bit about how you got started in that and maybe some of the experiences you've had as a result?
Yeah. I got started, it was, I was in college and I was studying literature essentially. And my last was like, I remember it was like winter break before my last semester of university. And me and some friends were talking about storytelling. It just kind of came up randomly. It was like, whatever, it was like this human thing, whatever happened to that? Or obviously like transmuted into like books and movies and all these other form marketing, right? Storytelling is everywhere, but like old school oral storytelling, which was like what our ancestors just always did. And that's how knowledge and culture and everything was transmitted,
Around
right?
the campfire, cavemen and whatnot.
Exactly. Around the campfire while working on stuff, while doing anything, just, like that was just the lifeblood of like intergenerational transmission. And, but it's of course shifted. And so we're like, whatever happened? And then I got back to my school, and while pre-registration for courses had already happened, at the last moment during registration, a new course came online called storytelling. And I was like, oh, whoa.
Kismet.
Yep, exactly. And so here we go. We're doing this. And so I did it. And it was taught by this professor who's on the cusp of retiring. He'd recently had an aneurysm. His memory was like shaky, but I recognized him because he'd always sit outside the literature building. He was this kind of round guy with white wispy hair, and he always had rainbow suspenders and like kind of a medicine pouch around his neck. I didn't know what it was at the time. And then, but like, I mean, like a indigenous kind of medicine pouch, not like, like a vitamin pill package.
Yeah, no, I got you. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. No, yeah.
Exactly. And so he was teaching it. It turns out his background was, he was part Cuban. His dad was Cuban and his mom was like Michigan Quaker. And he grew up like kind of like sometimes in Michigan, but most of the time in Cuba. And He had a lot of Afro-Caribbean like folks who cared for him as a child, and he was very exposed to their culture. And he picked up a lot of pieces here and there, and he had a crazy life, really fascinating guy. But he would teach the class, him and his grad student, where it was very small, it was like 6 or 7 of us in the class. And he would tell us a story in the beginning of the class. And then the next time we met as a class, we would, as a group, tell it back. And as a result, we kind of filled in the gaps of what we remembered or didn't remember, when we kind of retold the story and heard others retelling the story together. So I think it was our very first class, probably, maybe our second class. They told this Irish folk fairy tale of this man named Brian O'Brien, who was the man who knew no stories. He would sit with his friends in the pub every night, and they'd always be like, Brian, tell us a story. He'd be like, no. I don't tell stories. And he ends up, for various reasons, getting into this valley that no one went to because it was called the Valley of the Fairies, like old fairies, the dangerous kind, not the
Sure, yeah.
And so, but he had to go, and he went, and the fairies basically just take him on this crazy thing where at the end he discovers, actually, he can tell stories and does have stories to tell. Specifically, the crazy thing that happened with the fairies. It turns out to be a great story. And so it's this wonderful story about like unlocking storytelling potential, It's an old story. And so some friends of mine who didn't take the class were really curious about the class and decided that one night we would all gather together somewhere in the university and like share just stories with each other. Some of them like shared like the plot lines of video games they were into. Some of them shared like bits of like comics or graphic novels. And I don't know what I shared, but I remember on the way back, I don't know how it happened exactly, but it was middle of the night. It was Boston. It was freezing cold, I'm sure. And I find myself standing on a bench on the side of the road telling the story of Brian O'Brien. And it was just like this electric experience. it just kind of like, it was, like, okay, so to go to kind of the old school storytellers were oftentimes the shamans, especially when they were telling the old big stories of like
Right.
gods or the goddesses or whatever, right? The spirits. And it was like that, it was like an experience of channeling, it was like a lightning bolt was just kind of coursing through me, and I was just the channel in some way. And of course it was a story I had heard before, retold with the class, but now it just like flowed. And I was like, whoa, at the end of it, that was amazing. And in retrospect, the content was perfect, like the story that unlocks the key, of storytelling.
Right.
And I was at this stage in my college at that point where like I was just so done with school. I'd always been a very dedicated student, and all the way through school, and then continuing on through college. And it just like grad school was like the next obvious step. And I was like, oh my God, since I could remember, I was on a conveyor belt, and I'm just ready to jump off the conveyor belt. So I didn't know what I was going to do. So I left, and one thing led to another. I ended up teaching for a year. And in the course of that, I just started telling stories to the kids around lunch sometimes, and they would just want more. They were thirsty for it, And then
I'm sorry, this was in middle school?
Yeah, well, actually that year I taught some middle schoolers, but I also taught some preschool and kindergarten. It was a big smorgasbord.
Casting a wide net, yeah.
Very wide net, but it was the middle schoolers in particular, actually, that the kindergartners and preschools, everyone expected them to want stories, but it was the middle schoolers who I'd sit with at lunch who would just flock and say, tell us another, which motivated me to learn more stories and tell them more stories. And I was teaching math too, like 5th and 6th grade math, and like on days where it's just like, this isn't happening, I would just sometimes like tell a story, and was like, boom, the kids who couldn't sit still, right, the entire year, they could just sit there for like a 15-minute story, like captivated, right?
Middle schoolers, I think, get a bad rap too, because they have this reputation for being aloof and sullen and sulky and whatnot. And yet I've been reading aloud to them. I've been reading The Outsiders to them this year, which may be a little advanced for 6th grade, but like they're right there, and they listen to me read to them for an hour. I think that people forget that these are still kids, and they still enjoy being read to. So it doesn't surprise me at all that they enjoy listening to stories too.
Totally. And I find in general with middle school, I think what throws people off about it is that, especially once they hit like 7th grade, it's kind of this like, crest in that process. They're like a live wire because there's so much happening interpersonally, internally, biologically, right? And I think that energy is potentially overwhelming, and it is, especially when you have a whole bunch of them in the same room together, right? Which is not how nature intended the situation to be at all. And so there's a ton of energy going on, and I think oftentimes it gets clamped down by the system, and as a result, they go sullen, But when that energy is met and engaged with and allowed to flow in ways that are like invited and constructive, right? It can also get pretty destructive, like as far as like the social dynamics that can emerge. But when it's channeled in a way that really works, it's like popping. It's amazing, right? The energy is incredible. And I think one of the things, like stories, it's so wired into us that like we have the lock in our brains, and the key is the story. And as soon as it finds it, it's just like click, and everything just engages. And there's just this like connection happens, And so I think it's the same thing, reading to them, telling stories to them. It's just allows that energy that is there and doesn't find a lot of expression in like the classroom, usually, in most settings in the institutions. It's allowed to like engage and live in a way that often doesn't.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. So after you taught for a year, then you became world traveler, nomad, storyteller guy. What happened there?
I think within 24 hours of the school year ending, I was out of the country. I went to South Africa, which is where I was born. But I moved to the States when I was 4. But I had a lot of family still back in South Africa. And I traveled there as a kid with my family, but this was my first time going on my own. And I was planning on being there, I think 6 or 7 months. I ended up being there about a year. And then I left South Africa and went to Europe and was there for another months and months and months. And then I came back to the States, kept on traveling. And in that time, I had this was me jumping off the conveyor belt, right? I taught for a year, saved some money, and I didn't know what I was going to do with my life. I didn't have any direction. I didn't want any direction. But when people would ask me, like, what are you? What are you doing? And I'm like, I'm a storyteller. Just kind of like, I come across it. It was this thing that I discovered in Boston where there was a bit of a storytelling community outside of my college, that I tapped into. And so I met people who were storytellers. I came across various individuals and real characters. And I was like, and then because because I told the story that I was a storyteller and people believed me, they would invite me to come tell stories. They would introduce, oh, my friend's a storyteller, and I'd meet other storytellers. They'd take me to conferences that's storytelling in South Africa. I ended up like at gigs that friends of mine were doing that they were being paid for. So I was suddenly now like doing a professional gig. So now I was officially a professional storyteller, which is just another story. So by the time I got back to the States and had met all these other storytellers and had gotten to tell stories in all these ridiculous contexts, I was like, okay, well, I'm a professional storyteller now. And people were like, okay, here's money. Could you tell stories to this group of people or these kids? And once I saw that that was possible, I mean, I didn't have to make a lot of money at that point because I literally bought my friend's minivan, which was his parents' minivan that they used to take us to carpool in, and just traveled around the country and slept in the back of that. And so, you know, rent was very cheap. And as a result, I could just get a little gig here and a little gig here, but it showed me what was possible and where the interest lay. And so by the time I, in the process of that, met my wife, and then she was living in DC, we didn't get married at that point, but I moved in with her in DC. DC was this like rich hub of culture, and there was money for culture in DC, which is not often the case in many places, right? There's like museums and like big theaters and the national this and the national that. And so there's like actually like funding for things that can live there. So I was just like, okay, well, let's just see what happens. I worked on a farm for a while, but while I was working on a farm, I just started reaching out to anyone I could think of. I was like, hey, you know, storytelling would be really cool if you did it this way for like the zoo and you told the old stories about animals. So the National Zoo was like, okay, come. And I started leading storytelling things. They hired me to like write a birthday tour for their birthday party package where like people could take the kids on a tour of the zoo, but also tell stories from like old stories about the animals so they could connect with the animals in a deeper way. I got connected with NASA. I was like, there's so many stories about the stars. And they're like, you're right, let's do something. And so I worked with NASA for a few years doing stories of like total solar eclipses and the aurora borealis and old stories and news stories. And, you know, it just lived in this way. I was like, whoa, this is possible. I made a living as a storyteller. And so that's how it happened.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. It just sounds terrific. You know, it occurs to me, one of the students here at AOT said that she took a group of students to Washington, D.C. a few years back, and one of the best parts about it was a storyteller that she heard. And I'm wondering if it was you. I don't know what the timeline was, but that was
a while ago.
6 degrees of AOT or something. I don't know. So you know, David Letterman said once that anybody who's lived to the age of 21 and doesn't have 3 stories to tell should probably re-examine how they're living. Why do you think storytelling is so important, and how do you think we as teachers can incorporate it into the classroom? Should we? Is there even a reason to incorporate it into the classroom?
Yeah. You know, I mean, I think going back to what I'd said before, like humans are storytelling creatures. You know, one way that it's said, Elie Wiesel, right, who survived the Holocaust, wrote a bunch of other things. I used to teach it with my 7th graders, actually, Night. He was once quoted as saying, you know, God created humans because God loves stories. We are just storytelling creatures, right? Yeah. You know, and it's like, it's so what we do. It's when we get together, what do? We're just sharing stories, like what happened to me yesterday, what's going on for me, like our entire experience of the world, because we live in this world of ideas in a way that animals and plants and things don't, right? Like we don't have, without stories that like organize the world and give like a sense of, they create like the foundation for our kind of like non-physical experience of the world, right? It's like the stories, like these deep narrative structures that like organize the world and say what's meaningful, what's a good life, what matters in life, what doesn't matter in life, who am I, who are we as a family, as a tribe, as a culture, as a nation. These are all stories, right? And they're stories in a subtle way. They're like accounts. But there's also concrete stories in all of these, right? There's like every culture that you look at the stories that really determine what the building blocks of that culture are. Oftentimes America has its stories, Tucson has its stories, Arizona has its stories, humans have their stories, right? So there's this way in which like stories are in some ways like the DNA of culture. And so we just live and breathe stories, and we don't even realize it most of the time, right? Because every book, every movie, every show, every whatever, every newspaper article, every marketing ploy, it's like some level of storytelling going on. So that's one piece. So yeah, to not tap into, so we are tapping into it anyways as teachers, right? It's just kind of inevitable because it's what's happening. But nonetheless, to not tap into it overtly or purposefully leaves us missing like a really valuable tool because it's so foundational to who we are as humans. And as we were saying before, we can see it when we just, and I've worked with a lot of people, and I've done a lot of teacher trainings with different teachers and stuff like that. And oftentimes when I'm nudging them to like try telling a story, even if it's a story that I've already given them, I'm like, here's the story for this lesson plan. Tell it. They're like, oh, I don't know. It seems like intense to tell the story. 100% of the time, when they did it, as uncertain, as uncomfortable, as nervous as they were, as untrained, as they didn't have acting backgrounds or anything like that, they just tried it. The kids were like, and it was like the best part of the whole lesson. And they were like, whoa, what just happened? That was amazing. You know, it doesn't take a ton of skill. It's just doing it. And like the results are immediate and obvious, including with difficult ages that are difficult in a classroom setting, not because they're fundamentally difficult, right?
Yeah.
And so that's one piece of it, right? But then the other piece of it is like, for me as a teacher, I looked back on my teachers that I had. And I thought about what were the teachers that were the most impactful for me. And hands down, there was like a science teacher that I had in 5th and 6th grade. I didn't remember a thing that he taught. I remembered his stories. Crazy little, like, ridiculous stories he would tell about him and his brothers getting into gunpowder and like blowing up a tree in the forest because they went too far, or like, you know, like random stuff like that. That was just like, ultimately got him fired because he wasn't teaching a course. He was but he was by far the most impactful science teacher, or a teacher period, that I had. And it was because of his stories. So I ended up, once I realized that as a middle school teacher, every time that I was teaching and a story would pop into my mind, a personal story or a folk tale or whatever, I would think to myself, like, part of me would be like, is this relevant? And I just had a rule of thumb. Like, you might not know why it's relevant. Chances are it's relevant. Tell it, you know? And I had my curriculum, I had my structure, I did all of that stuff. But those stories, when they came through in a very, like, that's the other thing. There's a certain spontaneity and authenticity to storytelling because it's not necessarily scripted, right? I wouldn't personally like it scripted. But, you know, sometimes it can be. But that's the other thing that I think middle schoolers and high schoolers really are looking for, right? Is that authenticity. And it's like anything that just like on some subtle level doesn't comes across as like prefabricated or like a show. It's just like done, you know? So that's why actually when I'm doing storytelling with teenagers who are usually like storytelling, I usually do improv storytelling, because then they're just throwing things at me and I'm just flowing with it. And then it's just apparent that I'm just making crap up and they're seeing it. And so there's like there's an edge of authenticity that's just built into that. And they go with it. They love it because there's something alive. So I think that's a part of it, right? Like a story would pop into my head, which is traditionally organically how it would just happen, right? And in the process, it would be like, I'm just going to tell the story. And the kids would be like, whoa! And they would go with it and it would just like bring everything to life. It would change the flow of things. So I just think even just telling a story like that is powerful. And then finally, last point about teaching is that like good teaching is good storytelling. I mean, think about like history, ultimately, just to use one subject, right, is like the best stories we have, like the most formative moments of human history filtered down. Yet history for most kids is usually like the most boring subject alive. Like what happened there? That's ridiculous. So like to tell history, like good story, and then he cut off his head and betrayed this one and declared himself Pope, and like, what? You know, like that's the craziest stuff. Like, oh man, that's prime storytelling material, but it's not told as a story. Some teachers do, right? But not all those. And one of my history teachers did, and that's why like it lived. All the other history teachers didn't, and so it like died. So for me, it's like, it's not just there is storytelling, but there's also a piece, and this gets into acting and stage presence and all those kinds of things, where like any kind of teaching is ultimately a performance, because there you are and you're up in front of an audience. And to the extent that you can draw on these well-developed tools that these traditions of theater and storytelling have figured out and utilized so effectively, you're just going to be a better performer. You're going to grab interest more. You're going to know how to work with an audience. You're going to build excitement and interest and tension, and you're going to be able to utilize all the tools at your disposal, whether it's like your voice or your volume, your body, or your space or props. You pick up your desk and the kids are like, what just happened? You know, like, you know, you're just going to be so much more engaging. And then once that's there, then the content can just flow the way it's supposed to, which is through excitement and enjoyment and curiosity and ease and yada, yada.
No,
so, yeah.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate what, especially what you're saying about sharing personal stories, as long as they're school appropriate. I
Yeah,
think kids really
always,
appreciate
always.
seeing you as a human person, and I had to sit down with my principal end of the year observation stuff the other day, and he commended me on the theater stuff that I've been doing and the entertainment value that I've been trying to put in to my lesson planning and whatnot. And he made a point, because he's admin and he has to say things like this. He said, just make sure that they always tie directly into the curriculum. And I disagree with that. I think that as long as it's getting their attention, you can't provide them with curriculum until you have them paying attention. And especially
Mhm.
this year, where everyone's Zoomified and distant and whatnot, and you're just another app on their screen, basically, you need to get their attention before you can provide them with any curriculum. And if that means telling a personal anecdote that may tie into the lesson, great. If it means telling a story that doesn't relate at all, whatever. It takes 2 or 3 minutes out of class, and it humanizes you, and it
Mhm.
puts you not on the same level, because you still have to be a leader, but it I think puts you in the same community. And I think that's one thing that I'm getting from you, is that storytelling really helps invoke a sense of community, and it really brings people together.
Mhm.
And I think it's an absolute integral part of teaching. I think that you probably most people believe that they're probably not performers. Most teachers rather believe that they're not necessarily performers, and that it's not about entertainment. But most teachers also know that it's all about engagement, and they are not going to be engaged unless you bring the fire, unless you bring the passion. And if that means
Mhm.
rehearsing it the way you would a presentation, not necessarily scripting it, but maybe bullet pointing it, if that's what that means, then so be it. Do you think that people are born storytellers, or do you think it's something that needs to be nurtured and cultivated? Do you think that after the first time, because you said you had like a come to Jesus moment there, where the white light went through you and lightning
Mhm.
bolts and everything, but do you believe that it changes as immediately for most people, or is it something that really has to be worked on over time?
Yeah, I think like any human capacity, there's this kind of like gradation. Like, so on the one end, as long, like the majority of people, storytelling is just what we all do, right? When we're sitting around the table, like, provided we're able to like have certain levels of cognition and certain levels of communication, then with that in place, storytelling happens totally naturally. And so there's a very real, very, very real, and almost so real that like most people don't even see it, kind of real way in which we're all storytellers fundamentally, right? And almost every single person, if you ask them, who's like the storyteller in your family? Everyone's like, oh, Uncle Jimmy. He just goes around the Thanksgiving table and he tells these crazy stories. Like every family has like their storyteller. And just like with any role, like traditionally, like the tribe would just like have that one or two or three people who were just like the really good storytellers who more people wanted to listen to. And so in that kind of natural way, like there's like in a classroom has this classically, right? There's the class clown, and there's like the troublemaker, and there's the smart kids always raising their hand. Like these roles emerge very naturally in like human groupings. And I think storytelling is one of those. And so, yes, everyone does it. And some people just have a propensity for it. Some people just like very intuitively feel like what just makes a better story without even knowing it, and just do it. And so there's those two things, right? And just like with, like, say, sports, some people are born with a level of skill, and other people are born with a level of skill. And yes, even if you're born with a level of skill, if you don't work it, if you don't learn, if you don't train, you're never going to get to like the level of this great athlete. And if you're born with a lower level of skill and you work just as hard, you might not get as far as that person who becomes a great athlete. So there's this like whole continuum, right? Where like everyone's got it. Some people have it a little more easily. All of us can benefit from like working on it. And that doesn't necessarily mean that all of us are going to become like stage performers, because that's a whole kind of different thing of
Right.
storytelling, but it's a form of storytelling, right? And so, but some of us will just gravitate in that direction.
Yeah, I always use storytelling as a coping mechanism for myself whenever I'm going through a rather difficult time in my life. I always just tell myself it's going to make a better read at the end of my life.
Totally. It's like,
Um,
this is crappy, but it's going to be a good story one
I
day.
know,
Yeah.
because nobody, I think William Goldman, the prolific Hollywood screenwriter, said nobody wants to watch a movie about the village of the happy people, right? I mean, it's the conflict that stories come out of. I mean, how many of our stories are about a perfectly fine day day that we had. No, usually there's trouble. Usually there's conflict. Usually there's something going on that we have to overcome. And so if you look at it in hindsight from the end of your life and just go, gosh, I mean, even this past year, think of the stories that kids are going to have about COVID. You know, I mean, we went to a drive-in circus. I mean, when in the history of time are we ever going to go to a drive-in circus again? And then drive-in movie theaters are popping up all over the place, which is bizarre because as advanced as we're getting in technology, it's like we're regressing back to the 1950s and where certain entertainment is concerned. So yeah, I think that that it certainly helps as for me, at least personally, as a coping mechanism. Just to kind of look back at my life from the future, if that makes any sense.
I want to add one thing to that, though, which is also in the way that stories structure our sense of who we are, what matters. Stories provide meaning, right? Yeah. So to the degree that we as a community, as a world, as humanity can look back on this year and the stories that we tell about it and how we tell those stories and, you know, like what we focus on in that storytelling. I mean, that is very, very, in a very real way, how we make meaning of this experience, how we grow from it, learn from it, but even in deeper ways, how we heal from it, how we integrate that into the rest of our lives, right? So there's this way in which the stories that we tell and looking back on it, there's a way in which, it's like, it's fun. It's like, oh, I can tell this really cool story to like my grandkids one day, you know? But there's also a way in which, like, for all of us, it helps us. It's how we move in the world, you know? And the storytellers are like those, storytelling is like the building blocks as we take the next step forward into the next year and how we process the year that came.
Yeah, and what we take from it into the next year and how we adapt as a result, because next year's not going to look the same way 2 years ago did. Whatever next year looks like, there are going to be some changes put into an effect as a result of 2020, 2021. Let's jump track just for a second here. I know you've used some theater type games in your own education. I do a lot of improv videos and stuff myself. What first of all, what type of stuff have you done, and what do you think the value is? You know, people look at me and they're like, why are you teaching improv in ELA? I know why I'm doing it. Why would you suggest incorporating things like theater games or improv into a curriculum that isn't necessarily theater based?
Oh, totally. So, you know, I would say that one of the other, I think, shortcomings of our educational system is that, and it's shifting, but historically it's just going here. It's just looking at like the intellect. And so the idea that kids are just like, their bodies are in a desk and the teacher's like, blah, blah, blah. And they're like, receive, receive, receive. Right? Exactly. Yeah. That whole notion, I think we all know, has significant limits. And so, to the extent that a concept, a story, an idea, anything, right, can be not just like not just live as an idea in the abstract, but be played around with in an intellectual sense, but also in a very real sense, but also embodied, right, can be something that you engage with in an imaginative way, in a problem-solving way, and also moving kind of way, right? To that degree, that's just going to be a much deeper, much more profound, much more contextualized and interconnected kind of learning, you know, for the whole system, for the whole student, for the whole group too. So, and that also gets to what you said before, is very community building first and foremost. Just doing things that are different than almost any other class that they would ever do takes them out of their comfort zone. And by going out of their comfort zone together in a safe space, the connections just deepen and build, you know, that's first and foremost. That's wonderful. And that's, you know, just to say go back to what you were saying before, I think there's plenty of research out there, like really well documented, that, you know, the more there's connection between teacher and student, the more there's a felt connection between students and each other, the more learning is going to happen, period. Right? So there's just, you nurture that community. But even outside of that, from the content point of view, giving students a chance to get up and move and play and create and problem solve and have fun and laugh and be silly and be zany, and to do it like around an idea that you're trying to teach them, it's like, it does everything you need. It like changes the flow of the class, right? Because you always want to be I always think in modules when I'm teaching. Like, here's for 5 minutes and they're sitting and listening, and here's 10 minutes and they're having conversations, and here's 3 minutes and they're writing, you know, and like keep changing the modality keeps them engaged, right? It keeps a kind of a dynamic quality to the class. So it's just a great way to bring a totally different modality online. Like, now we're going to stand up and we're going to do this crazy thing, and we're going to be loud and we're going to be silly, but it's also contained, because the other problem that we face in modern school systems is like, we're not like running around the forest together where we can just be as loud as we want, as crazy as we want, and break anything that we want, you know, like we're in a classroom and with a whole bunch of kids that are all like on the cusp of chaos at any moment by sheer nature of being kids. So there's like a certain like level of containment that is necessary. The beautiful thing about a well done drama game or improv game or anything, right, is that it creates the structure where like intense energy, zaniness, craziness can emerge, but it's contained by the rules of the game. Right. And it's ultimately kind of brought together at the end as well. So it's kind of like the perfect way to like channel some of that energy that kids and middle schoolers have, but all kids have, all humans have.
And middle schoolers.
And middle schoolers too. And then some, right?
Yeah.
But you do it in a way that works within the container of a classroom. Whereas a lot of times, a lot of the kinds of things that you would ultimately want to do with them may not work in the container of a classroom, you know?
Yeah.
And so it's just such a perfect melding of like all those different things, changing up the modality, giving them a way of integrating and engaging with the content with multiple modalities, and thinking about different kinds of learners too. Is it visual? Is it auditory? Is it kinesthetic? If it's all of them, whoa, you got a good chunk right there. And then it's just like playing around with a concept. It's one thing to receive a concept, right? It's another thing to repeat the concept, but to actually like play with the concept, to like do it this way and do it this way. And oh, he just did it this way, and now we're doing it this way. I mean, we're talking very abstractly here, but like we could go into a specific drama game and see how that works. But you know, you're like, it's a way of engaging with the material that's such a deeper kind of learning than just like the idea itself, right? Yeah. So it just works on so many different levels.
Yeah, and I really like the cultivating the whole yes and mindset. You know, I mean, especially with middle schoolers and high schoolers, where their forte seems to be combativeness and arguing, to really kind of steer them in a direction of supporting each other, as opposed to trying to be the cleverest person in the room and trying to get their point across. Really kind of building these communication skills together where everybody has each other's back, because I think it's antithetical to the way most middle schoolers and high schoolers typically behave. You know, they're there to show who's the cleverest and who's the sassiest and who's the smartest, rather than showing how well they can work with others. But I think it's a much more important skill. Great. So you're super sarcastic. That's nice. How is that going to further you in life? But really working together as a team, really supporting each other, really building upon each other's ideas, I think is an invaluable skill, regardless of what subject that you're teaching. We're getting toward the end here. I'm wondering if, and I know I'm putting you on the spot with this here, but I'm wondering if you might have, because we've talked a lot about storytelling today, but I'm wondering if you might have a small, short, little 2 to 5 minute story that you could share, just so we get kind of a sense of what you're talking about.
Yep. Well, you know, as it happens, as we were talking, a story popped into my mind, and I thought to myself, it kind of fits, it kind of doesn't fit. But I was like, I just said that if a story pops into my mind, I have to share it. And it's a very short story, so I'm going to share it with you. First of all, when I tell a story, one of the traditions that I draw on is a tradition that that first storytelling teacher of mine, his name was Luis Iglesias, he used, and I don't know where he picked it up. It was from one of like the Afro-Caribbean maids who he knew when he was a kid or somewhere else, but it's a Haitian story tradition, where the storyteller says crick and the listener says crack at the beginning and at the end. Okay.
Gotcha.
And then I'll share this story. So it goes like this: crick,
crack.
Once upon a time, there was this little old lady who, at this stage in her life, she kind of just had all the time in the world. She would watch the sky, she would watch the butterflies, and the best place to watch everything going on was right at one of the gates that led into the walled town that she lived in way back in the day when towns had walls around them. You know, there'd just be a couple of gates and the guards would be there, but that's where everything was happening. Strangers coming and going, caravans going through, and it's just a lot of excitement. And, you know, outside of the city, there's the forest and the trees. Inside the city, there's all the houses and the buildings. And so it was like a cool place to be. She also had a reputation in her town as always speaking the truth, no matter what, whether it's comfortable or uncomfortable. She just always said it as it was, right? So here she is one day sitting there just by the gate, watching the butterflies and the clouds and the people coming and going. And she sees this man approaching. And by the way he's dressed and even the way he's walking on a subtle level, she can tell he's not from around there. He's a stranger. And sure enough, as he's coming up to the gate and he sees this little lady sitting there, he goes up to her and he says, excuse me, you live here, right? She was like, yes, I do, Sonny. And he says, what's this town like? I've never been here before. And she's like, well, tell me, what's it like where you come from? And he's like, oh, where I live, it's a horrible place. It's crowded, it's cramped, it stinks, it's dirty, the people are rude. And she's like, well, I'm afraid that this place is going to be much like that. And he's like, figured. And he goes walking into the town. And so she goes back to watching the butterflies and the clouds and the trees and the houses and the people. And another stranger wearing different kind of clothes and a different gait comes walking up. And he sees her sitting there and he says, oh, hi, what's this town like? I've never been here. And she says, oh, well, Sonny, tell me, what's it like where you live? And he's like, oh, well, it's a wonderful place. The architecture is beautiful. The people are so kind. There's such a camaraderie and sense of community. And she says, well, here, you'll find it will be just like that. And he's like, oh, so glad to hear. Thank you. And he goes walking into town. And she goes back to watching the clouds and the butterflies, knowing that, true to her reputation, she only spoke the truth. Crick.
Crack. Very nice. Very nice. I love it. Let me ask you just one more question, because, gosh, I mean, you're so engaging of a storyteller. A good thing, because, you know, it's your profession. But, you know, we struggle so much with keeping our students' attention, with keeping them engaged. What do you think, if you were able to crystallize the secrets of the universe when it comes to being an engaging speaker or storyteller or teacher, in order to keep their attention long enough to engage them in whatever it is, very important lesson you're trying to get across? What do you think some of those things might be?
Yeah, so I think maybe two lines that connect. One is, you know, in some ways, and you touched on this a little bit before about how all stories have a problem, have a conflict, have an issue, have a dilemma, something that has to be worked out. And ultimately, good storytelling, as in any form, whether it's a novel or a movie or play or whatever, is fundamentally about like the sculpting of tension, right? Because it could just be like, they had this problem, this is what they did, and it worked out okay, done. So you've told the whole thing, but you haven't done anything to sculpt the tension. And a good movie or a good story or whatever, it takes it and touches it here and then touches it here and builds it here, and you think it's going to get better, but it's getting worse. And, and you're just like shaping it, and you're not just shaping it with the narrative flow, but you're also shaping it with your tone and your volume. If you're doing storytelling, if it's a book or if it's a movie, you know, you got the soundtrack in a movie, and you got the lighting, and so many ways to play with like the tension and to sculpt tension. Mm-hmm. So I would say that fundamentally that's what engages us, right? We're just like, whether we like it or not, we're drawn to problems. That captures our attention, which is why the news is the news the way it is, right? Because like problems sell and catch people's eyes. Right. And so to think about the tension in anything that we're presenting to kids, granted, it's a little harder when you're teaching math, but like, yeah, if you got like a problem,
that makes me tense.
Huh?
Math makes me tense.
Exactly, right? It could be like the inner tension of engaging with the material. It could be just the tension of like literally what you're doing is solving problems. And it's like, you know, if it's I studied math, I taught math, and I get how challenging it can be to present math in this way. But there are inroads. I know and there are curriculum out there that utilize stories and different kinds of things. But, you know, but then you think about any of the humanities, and you can find the story, you can find the tension. You know, there's always the thing to be worked with. Even if it's just any good lesson could follow that same narrative arc that a good story follows, right? You build it up, you bring it to like the grand reveal, the climax, and then there's the resolution and the summary and the review and however you want to look at it, right? There's that trajectory. So to think about like good teaching, good engage, like that engages, that's how we're built to be engaged, right? As a human, as our minds, they engage naturally when we're presented something that does that builds tension and then relieves it, right? Releases it. And so I think to the degree that we can find that in our classes, in our lesson plans, and, you know, and build it into whatever we're doing, we're just going to be more successful at engaging. And coupled with that, the thing that I said earlier. There's a certain level of authenticity that I think is absolutely crucial, right? And you also touched on it when you mentioned like that passion, right? The kids can feel it. If we're,
Right.
there's the burnt out teachers, and for good reason they're burnt out, but those burnt out teachers, and it's just apparent, right? They've just like lost the flame, and kids don't feel it, and so the kid, it makes it harder and makes them more likely to be burnt out and everything like that. The extent to which we can like tap into like our own curiosity, our own excitement about whatever the material is, such that then to couple the two together, when we're building the tension, we're there with it, right? It's not just like artifice. We're not just doing it on the surface and inside we're like, when am I going to get out of this place, right? We're like in the story as we're telling the story, or we're in the contents. Like we're there as like, what's his name? Henry V is like deciding to like behead his wives and like, like become the leader of the church in England, right? I hope I got the right number for Henry.
I think that was the 8th, I think.
Oh, there you go. Sorry.
Henry V was once more under the breach, dear lads,
Cool, thanks. So like, if we're there with the story and like the intensity of it, and like what it must have really been like to be there, like I often think, again, it's kind of like this shamanic thing. It's like you have one foot in the world, in a shamanic way would be called the spirit world, but let's just call it the world of the story, the world of imagination, the world of dream, like the good storyteller is the bridge. The good shaman is the bridge between the worlds, between their tribe and like the spirit realm. And the good storyteller, the good director, the good writer is so fully in the world of that story that what they deliver to the audience is so airtight, is so fully believable, because the conduit is so there that they fully believe it.
Present.
Not in a way that they're like delusional, but in a way that they're like in the moment that the actor is acting that part, they're there. That's it, right? Like the method acting technique in that sense, right? And so in the sense that like we can build the tension, so we have to have the external skill to do that well, and that's something that we can play with, and that's part of the fun of it. Like if we play with it, and we even play with it with the students, like, we learn over time. We don't have to be perfect, and it's not a perfect game, right? It's always a messy situation whenever you're teaching anyone. And so the like engage with the playful kind of modality to like learning the skills of building that tension and stuff. And while we're doing that, having one foot just really in the tension itself, whatever it is, the lesson, the content, the story, the excitement about the content. So even if it's a math problem, it's like, whoa, like someone figured out algebra. Like, that's cool stuff. Algebra is really, like, at one point humans didn't know that. They just didn't know that. People figured that out over like hundreds of years. And it's like, to like get into that excitement, whatever doorways we find into it, it's like that's going to bring the students with us.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you so much for spending some time with me today. If there were to be one big takeaway for somebody listening to our conversation here today, what would you want that to be?
What's coming to mind is like, like if our lives are just stories, not just, but if our lives are like stories, which I think they are, and within a sea of stories, then it seems like the most obvious thing that we want to tell them well. and to help our students tell them well, tell the stories of their lives, right? And to have the tools to do that with. So I think anything we do, if we can tell it well, we're shining in a very human kind of way.
Absolutely. Well, Mercy, I mean, I could go on for another 20 minutes. It's just fascinating talking to you here, and yet I have to go feed my kids. So I got to bring it to a close. But thanks again so much for spending some time here today. I really, really appreciate you taking the time to pop into this little virtual room of ours here and sharing some of your stories with us today.
It's a pleasure. Totally. It's a joy to share this stuff. So love it.
All right. We'll talk to you soon. Take care, buddy.
Take care. Bye.